Russian Revolution broadened the prospects for Japan to expand even further, as our diplomats and military planners focused their attention upon the railways that connected European Russia, Manchuria, and the Far East. Yet, any movement by the Japanese in northern Manchuria and eastern Siberia threatened to bring them into contact with those American financiers and politicians who continue to be fascinated by the prospect of linking their nation's Great North Railway with the Trans-Siberian Railway by means of shipping lanes that stretch from Seattle to Vladivostok. Like the Japanese, these men hoped to profit from Russia's domestic turmoil, and, again like the Japanese, they identified their schemes with their nation's interests and pressed their government to support them. In spring of 1917, the United States therefore sent a railway advisory commission to Vladivostok and Petrograd for the publicly announced purpose of helping the provisional government restore its collapsing rail system. Headed by John Frank Stevens, former chief engineer of the Panama Canal, and supported by the Railway Service Corps, which the United States later sent under the command of the Great Northern Railway's general manager George Emerson. This commission became the instrument of men dedicated to strengthening America's position in Asia. As they moved quickly from advising Kerensky's government to managing Asiatic railways, their presence strengthened their nation's sphere of influence in eastern Siberia at the expense of the Japanese. Both Americans and Japanese thus looked to some form of intervention to strengthen their interests in the maritime provinces of Asiatic Russia, although each had different goals and very different types of intervention in mind. The Americans hoped that the restored railway network could help the whites reestablish a strong Russia, one mighty aspiring democracy. President Wilson's envoy had said the previous summer that could prevent the Japanese from strengthening their foothold in Far East Asia, while the Japanese preferred the breakdown of Russia's railways that would enable them to broaden their influence on the Asiatic mainland. Both hoped to legitimize any intervention in the Far East by trying to tie it to actions by other Allied powers. Yet, at the beginning of 1918, each hoped to prevent the other from seizing initiative. While their allies debated what policy to adopt towards Russia's new Bolshevik government, the United States and Japan made preparations to intervene in Russia's far eastern lands. The Japanese by taking military action, and the Americans by committing great sums of money and supplies to strengthen Siberia's railroads, while insisting that the success of any such undertaking will depend largely upon the wholehearted support of all the great powers. The Japanese had begun their preparations to march into Siberia nearly 3 months before the preparations to march. Japanese military preparations are being completed rapidly. America's advisor, Roland Morris, reported from Tokyo at the beginning of March. Troops are concentrating at West Coast ports. 2 divisions have already been sent to Korea. At the beginning of April, some of these newly mobilized Japanese troops found themselves aboard the cruisers Asai and Iwami, which stood at anchor in Vladivostok Harbor, along with the USSS Brooklyn and the HMS Sofia. In response to a small incident in which the Russians killed 3 Japanese, Admiral Kato sent 500 Marines into Vladivostok on April 5th, and the commander Bitten Suffolk sent 50 British troops ashore to support them. Although the Japanese insisted that the Marines would have been withdrawn as soon as possible, the first military intervention in Siberia had been accomplished. It is almost inevitable that the Japanese will advance, Lenin warned when he received news of their landing. Undoubtedly, the Allies will help them. That gloomy prediction proved all too accurate. Within 6 months, the handful of forces from Asai, Iwami, and Suffolk had swelled into invading armies. Before the end of 1918, 73,000 Japanese, 2,500 English, 1,000 French, 1,500 Italians, and over 8,000 Americans had entered Siberia to support the Czechs. While the Allies marched into Russia's Far East provinces, those anti-Bolshevik forces that made their way to Siberia after the October Revolution replaced local Bolshevik regimes with new governments. At first centered upon the intellectuals and politicians who had gravitated to the Siberian University of Tomsk, the Provisional Government of Autonomous Siberia claimed its legitimacy of the Siberian Regional Duma, dispensed by the Bolsheviks at the end of January 1918. First headed by an obscure socialist revolutionary by the name of Peter Derber, some of the dispersed Duma deputies formed anti-Bolshevik governments the moment they learned of the Czechs' first victories, and raised the green and white flag as the symbol of the forests and snows of the autonomous Siberia they hoped to create. Within a month, this government had set up its headquarters in the western Siberian city of Omsk, moved sharply to the right, annulled all laws issued by the Bolsheviks, and restored all confiscated private property to its owners. Typical of anti-Bolshevik movements all over Russia, Lenin's Siberian opponents squandered vital energy and resources in conflicts among themselves. None fought more bitterly with the Provisional Government of Autonomous Siberia during the summer of 1918 than the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly, known by its Russian acronym Komuk, whose leaders proclaimed an independent government at the moment the units of the Czech Legion drove the Red Guards out of the Volga River city of Samara. Comprised mainly of socialist revolutionaries, the Komuk government proclaimed its support for a united, independent, free Russia and demanded that Russia's dispersed constituent assembly be restored. Like the provisional governments of autonomous Siberia, the Komuk government returned privately owned factories to their former owners. Repudiating all socialist experiments, the committee considers that it is impossible to establish capitalist forms of industry at the present time. Its leaders announced, capitalist forms of industry must exist, and capitalists as a class must be allowed to direct them. More dramatically than any other white government to date, Komuk promised to reopen the Eastern Front against the Germans and Austrians in return for Allied aid against the Bolsheviks, and began to mobilize all men between the ages of 20 and 23 for military service in an army from which political organizations, assemblies, and speeches were to be excluded. Like the Provisional Government of Autonomous Siberia further to the east, Komuk government expanded its territory quickly during the summer of 1918. Led by Colonel V.O. Kappel, whose genius for using small detachments of land forces in conjunction with a fleet of riverboats allowed him to strike far in the rear of his red adversaries. The forces of the Komuk government seized by the key cities of Ufa and Sibirsky, the birthplace of Lenin, before the end of the July. Then, on August 7th, the Komuk army drove troops of the Bolsheviks from Kazan, ancient capital of the Tartars, and scene of Ivan the Terrible's great victory over them in 1552. Famed for the university that once had been the home of the great 19th century mathematician Nikolai, Kazan had long been a center of Russian learning, trade, and industry, and stood as the last major military obstacle between the Komuk forces and Moscow, with their commander confessing to a chaos of unpreparedness among his forces, in which many of his units proved incapable of fighting en masse because of lack of preparation and discipline. The Bolsheviks fled Kazan so precipitously that they abandoned a gold reserve worth more than 6,500 million rubles that the Tsarist government had stored in the city's bank state. Unlike the volunteer army in the south or the provisional government of autonomous Siberia to the east, the Komuk government thus emerged from its first battles in the summer of 1918 with the financial resources to fight a serious war. If the Komuk government enjoyed the means that other whites lacked, it also suffered the fatal flaw. The government was socialist, revolutionary, a party unconciliatory even with the Khedives, one of its leading generals pointed out, while its army consisted of right-wing elements hostile to socialist revolutionaries. The men destined to fight and win the battles of the Komuk government therefore stood unalterably opposed to the politics of the socialist revolutionary leaders, who also failed to win the broad social base of its mass support needed to sustain any long-term opposition against the Bolshevik government of workers and peasants. The Whites' early successes only added to the Bolsheviks' fears. As fragile Bolshevik defenses collapsed in lands far from Russia's red center, Lenin and his comrades faced a terrifying prospect that the Whites and their allies might wield their separate offensives into a solid ring that would squeeze the life from Russia's red heart. White forces churned up the frontiers of the Russian land in a manner unknown since the troubled times in which bad things happen. Neither the discipline nor the dogma of war communism seem to have much in evidence when Petrograd's leading Bolsheviks discussed the formation of a new government on October 27, 1917. Rejecting the title minister as a foul, worn-out term, Lenin seized upon Trotsky's suggestion that men who would lead Russia's first revolutionary socialist government be called People's Commissars, a type born in the fires of revolution, and that the government as a whole should be known as the Soviet, that is, Council of People's Commissars. Between them, these 15 men had spent more than 2 centuries in exile as Tsarist prisoners. 5 among them had been imprisoned for their political activities within the previous 3 months, and Lenin had ended a life as a fugitive from the Kerensky's police a scant 48 hours earlier. Yet, finding men to bring down Kerensky's government proved much easier than naming statesmen to replace it. If ever triumphant revolutionaries lacked experience in the business of governing, it was Russia's first Soviet of People's Commissars. None among them had ever held a government post, or even worked in a government office, and none could claim any first-hand experience with the sorts of problems that their commissariats needed to resolve. We did not even know how to set about the job, and we had to resort to the messengers, who worked in the department for 2 decades and had seen dozens of bosses change. One Bolshevik confessed when he recalled his first days at the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. Such messengers, he wryly added, as if sensing the absurdity of the situation, turned out to be quite well informed. Thus, many Bolsheviks moved bravely to build their new world, with only a vague sense of what needed to be done or how to accomplish it. Lenin knew his comrades' failings all too well, yet, in the heady naivety of victory, he believed that the revolutionary dedication, boldness, and Bolshevik party discipline would offset the inexperience that afflicted them all. How helpless, spontaneous, and incidental were our first steps, he wrote later. To govern seemed to be to them the easiest thing of all. Some weeks before, when he had spoken of the new institutions that would follow a Bolshevik seizure of power, Lenin had cautioned that this new apparatus is bound to make mistakes in taking its first steps. Still, he remained certain that 250,000 Bolsheviks could govern Russia far better than 1,300 million landowners who have condemned the vast majority of inhuman toil and semi-starvation. The mystique surrounding Russia's old bureaucracy must be shattered, stripped of every shadow of privilege, of every semblance of official grandeur. The people made to understand such a state administration had long since been reduced to such exceedingly simple operations of registration, filing, checking, that they can be easily performed by any literate person. Aged between 28 and 33, and charged with commanding soldiers and sailors who walked away from the war without so much as a backward glance, People's Commissars Pavel, Vladimir, and Nikolai had considerably less than a decade of military experience between them, and none had held a position of authority. After 4 years as a common seaman, Dybinko had been sent to prison for leading a mutiny on the battleship Emperor Paul I, a death sentence commuted to 20 years in prison, from which he soon escaped, had cut short Antonov's brief career as an army ensign in 1906, and Krylenko a student of history and law at St. Petersburg University, had served the Bolsheviks for a decade as a labor organizer before the Tsarist authorities sent him to the front in the spring of 1916 as punishment for his revolutionary activities. When Antonov took command of Russian Red forces fighting against the Whites along Russia's southern frontiers, and Krylenko assumed command of Russia's Supreme Army headquarters at Mykolaiv, Nikolai Pavlovsky took their place as well. A man who had studied for the priesthood before he became a revolutionary, Podvolsky had been wounded during a street battle in the provincial capital in October 1905. But he had held no post of military command before the 9th of October 25th, 1917, when he and Antonov had commanded the Bolsheviks' assault against the Winter Palace. Nor were the other appointees any better prepared. The Bolsheviks expected Ivan, the schoolteacher, son of a provincial factory worker, to face an urgent crisis of his nation's war-torn economy. As People's Commissar for Finance with no experience in banking, they looked to Viktor Nobel, a dedicated party activist, whose only experience with anything related to trade and manufacture had been as a teenage dryer to avert the collapse of Russia's industry and commerce that the chaos of revolution had made all but certain. Aside from a childhood and adolescent spit in the Caucasus, he had the fact that an essay of his had caught Lenin's eye. From the start, however, they could find it difficult to see the day-to-day affairs of their offices. Civil servants and other white-collar workers in Petrograd greeted the October Revolution by staying away from their desks, so the Bolsheviks found many government offices empty when they arrived to take command. At the former Minister of Internal Affairs, newly appointed Bolshevik officials found only a heap of scrap papers, locked desks, and cabinets without keys, while Trotsky found many empty offices, from which absent officials had removed all codebooks and keys to safes that held important documents. When he took up his duties as Commissar for Foreign Affairs, elsewhere, sullen officials threw away their pens and poured out all the ink. Bank employees stubbornly refused payment on drafts signed by People's Commissars, and diplomats who had represented the provisional government abroad refused to speak in the capitals of Europe and America. Despite office workers' hatred for the Bolsheviks and the Bolsheviks' diatribes against bureaucracies and bureaucrats, neither dared to do without the other for very long. Lenin quickly conceded that it was impossible to talk about destroying the bureaucracy immediately, everywhere, and completely. And Russia's old regime bureaucrats soon decided that even Bolshevik masters were preferable to none at all. A longing for the routine to which they were accustomed, one observer explained, soon drove many of Petrograd's bureaucrats back to their desks to immerse themselves in the comforting and certain routines to which they dedicate their lives. One needed only to see the passion with which they seized upon memoranda, reports, and the subtleties of office routine, he went on, to understand that it would be more difficult for them to live without this atmosphere of papers and documents than without bread or boots. Men who had rendered dedicated service to Tsarist provisional governments therefore returned to serve the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks, despite Lenin's insistence that the remuneration of all servants of the state should be reduced to the level of working men's pay, soon began to buy the expertise of these experienced bureaucrats at premium wages. The Bolsheviks' effort to govern from their revolutionary command post added to the confusion of their first attempts to bring order to Russia. All the world seemed to have business, John Reed's companion remembered. Busy, humming this hive, the heart and the soul of the revolution. Russia's new People's Commissars, stood in the revolution's vortex. There, Trotsky had established the revolutionary command post from which the Bolsheviks had overthrown Kerensky's government, and Lenin had taken his rightful place as the Bolsheviks' commander-in-chief. To all who shoved their way through the joyous jostling throng that guzzled cauldrons of cabbage soup and wolfed great hunks of meat and black bread, it seemed certain that Russia's brave new world was being shaped in the crowded corridors. None among the Bolsheviks wished to stand apart. Destined never to be forgotten as the command post of the Bolshevik Revolution, Smolny, nonetheless, could never become its general headquarters, and the Bolsheviks' failure to understand that simple truth proved to be one of its first tragedies. Only the bureaucratic centers housed in Russia's former ministries stored the vital information needed to grapple with that nation's crises, and only those centers controlled the vital chain of command that could carry new laws and regulations into Russia's northern remote corners. Every hour that the People's Commissars rode the revolutionary whirlwind at Smolny therefore delayed their contact with the world beyond, where people continued to freeze, starve, and be shot by the tens of thousands. Nor did moving the capital to Moscow, where newly arrived commissars and commissariats jousted for place and preference, well into the spring of 1918 in what Trotsky once labeled a fierce struggle for office space to improve the Bolsheviks' understanding of the land and people that they had to govern. What a mess we're in! Lenin exclaimed as he struggled to maintain contact with feuding government officers that had scattered themselves all across the city. For several crucial weeks, it seemed impossible to know what was going on in Moscow, let alone other parts of Russia. Combined with new and bitter rivalries in the Kremlin, such worries diverted Russia's revolutionary leaders from some of the most serious problems in the countryside. Unable to share the dreams and passions of rural folk, the Bolsheviks never knew the ways of Russia's villages, nor sensed their tensions. Too many among them remained urban revolutionaries to whom fate had given charge of a nation of peasants. While the Bolsheviks had struggled to seize their nation's industrial centers in 1917, a rural Russia had seethed, its illiterate masses exhausted by war, overwhelmed by poverty, and bent upon by revenge. For centuries, Russia's countryfolk had dreamed of surrendering the chains of serfdom and claiming the estates held by men who did not share their labor in the fields. They had hoped in vain that the time for land and freedom had come after they had driven Napoleon's grand army from Russia in 1812, again after they had defeated Russian southern bastion in Sevastopol during the Crimean War, and yet again in 1861, when the Tsar Liberator Alexander II had decreed their emancipation. Always, the lands their ancestors had looked upon with such longing had eluded their grasp. Now, they would wait no longer. During the summer and fall of 1917, tens of millions of angry countryfolk stubbornly took control of Russia's woodlands, meadows, and farmlands. Malignant discord, stubborn, silent, and deep, therefore held undisputed sway as rural Russia moved through its first revolutionary year. Outside the cities, no formulae applied save one: the land belongs to those who can till it. Among Bolsheviks, who for a quarter century paid scant attention to the wants of Russia's petty bourgeoisie peasants, none sensed the deep urgency that seized rural Russia in 1917 more certainly than Lenin. If the peasants take the land, he warned, those who had opposed his demand that Bolsheviks declare themselves in favor of transferring all land to the peasants, you can be certain that they will not ask us for permission to do it, nor will they give it back. As one provisional government cabinet after another met the rising violence in Russia's countryside with solemn insistence that any decision about dividing up the land must await the end of the war and the opening of a constituent assembly, Lenin had called boldly for the abolition of private landed estates without compensation. If power is placed in the hands of the Soviets, the landowners of these estates will immediately be declared inalienable as property of the whole people. Certain that the peasants' call for land must be answered, Lenin spoke some of his first words after the Bolsheviks' victory to them at the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies on the evening of October 26th. Solemnly and deliberately, he set down the principles that private ownership of land shall be abolished forever, and that all land shall pass into the use of those who cultivate it, and that the right to use the land shall be accorded to all the citizens of the Russian state desiring to cultivate it. A number of other generally stated principles, most of them taken directly from the long-standing program of socialist revolutionaries, filled out Lenin's brief speech. We want no details in this decree, he explained. We must trust that the peasants themselves will be able to solve the problem correctly, properly, and better than we could do it. Peasants, not bureaucrats, must settle peasant affairs. Most of all, the peasants should be firmly assured that there are no more landowners in the countryside, and that they themselves must arrange their own lives. In Smolny's Great Hall, the stale smells of tobacco, smoke, damp boots, and human sweat contrasted strangely with the freshness of Lenin's words. Some years later, his wife recalled an elderly peasant whose face shone with a peculiar waxen transparency and whose eyes glistened with a certain special light, as he had come to understand for the first time in Russia's 1,000-year history, the land would belong to those who toiled upon it. So plunged the Bolsheviks ahead. The radical young American journalist Young Reed concluded that they, the only people in Russia who had a definite program of action, while others talked for 8 long months. Lenin's words rekindled visions long held among his nation's peasants, and the people, whom Gorky once called the half-savage, stupid, slow-witted folk of Russia's hamlets, began the long-awaited black reparation that promised justice, economic security, and the drawing of a new era to the poorest among them. Within a few months, Russia's peasants had increased their landholdings by something over 50 million acres. Yet, even 50 million acres, almost twice the size of modern-day East Germany, proved all too little when divided among nearly 100 million peasants. The black reparation, therefore, brought none of the economic improvements that the peasants had expected, and, like so many of their dreams, the long-awaited panacea of the Lord's land thus proved to them an empty hope. If one were to divide all the Lord's land among the peasants, then each would get about 1/3 of an acre. Amazingly, that crudely formulated prediction based on the conditions in a single province in Russia's overpopulated Black Earth Center proved sadly close to accurate for Bolshevik Russia as a whole. When it came to relieving the terrible poverty that had gripped Russia's villages for so many centuries, the peasants' determination to seize those lands that belonged to lords, church, or state counted for little. During the winter and spring of 1917 to 1918, the Black Reparation undid more than a decade of careful government efforts to develop capitalistic agriculture in Russia by doing away with the peasant commune. Long regarded as a major reason for the primeval backwardness that ruled the Russian countryside, the peasant commune had come under heavy attack in the wake of the revolutionary events of 1905. After a year in which orderly crowds of peasants and workers had been shot down in front of the Winter Palace, and mutiny had torn the Black Sea Fleet, and a general strike had blanketed the Russian Empire during October, Russia's statesmen had begun the complex task of transforming their nation's ancient autocracy into a constitutional monarchy. A critical part of that process had been an effort by the last great Tsarist statesman, Peter Stoplin, to shape his nation's peasants into a conservative political force by encouraging a comparative handful of energetic peasant farmers to consolidate their scattered landholdings into separate farms and break away from the commune altogether. An unvarnished attempt to sharpen distinctions between haves and have-nots in Russia's villages, Stoplin's reforms thus had aimed to reward hard-working peasants at the expense of those who were not, and to increase crop yields that ranked among the lowest in Europe. Soaring agricultural output had rewarded his efforts. On the eve of the First World War, Russia's grain production reached a level that the Soviet state would not match until the 1960s, and it was clear to all that the days of Russia's peasant communes were numbered. Then, during the winter of 1917 to 1918, Lenin's vaguely stated decree on land gave them a new and unlooked for lease on life. By attempting to force Stoplin's newly created class of independent farmers back into traditional peasant villages, Russia's rejuvenated communes undercut more than a decade of progress toward modernizing agriculture. At the same time, they worked against the Bolsheviks' desperate efforts to seize surplus grain from Russia's villages during the spring and summer of 1918. The toiling peasantry thus proved far less biddable than urban-oriented Bolshevik theorists had expected when they began to put the rigid mobilization measures of war communism into effect during the summer of 1918. Even when organized into those 130,000 committees of poor that blanketed Russia's countryside by the end of 1918, poor peasants proved reluctant to seize the grain of their communal brethren, and they continued to hinder Bolshevik efforts to mobilize the human and material resources of the Russian countryside until the Civil War's end. In addition to millions of peasants, other sections of the population and economy commanded the Bolsheviks' attention, as Russia entered what Lenin referred to as the period of expropriation of the expropriators, which heralded the transition from capitalism to socialism. First and foremost, the Bolsheviks set nationalization of Russia's banks as one of their chief goals, because, as Lenin warned at one point, for any revolutionary government to try to govern without doing so would be like trying to snatch odd kopecks while closing one's eyes to millions of rubles. Yet, despite Lenin's confident prediction that it was merely a question of breaking the resistance of an insignificant minority before a single state bank, the biggest of the big, with branches in every rural and in every factory, could be established, Russia's banks at first posed problems that Russia's proletariat revolutionaries found particularly awkward to overcome. Banks in Petrograd opened and shut their doors unpredictably, permitted or refused withdrawals as they saw fit, and refused to honor drafts signed by Russia's new People's Commissars or by representatives of those factories in which workers had seized control. When failed attempts at negotiations, compromises, and informal agreements left them without even the cash needed to meet day-to-day government expenses and factory payrolls, the Bolsheviks resorted to force. The iron hand that destroys also creates, Lenin told the people on December 14th. Bolsheviks, he insisted, must adopt extraordinary revolutionary measures in order to normalize the country's economic life immediately and comprehensively. Even as Lenin spoke, Red Guards and loyal Bolshevik sailors occupied Russia's banks. The day before, after several days of careful preparation, Nikolai Povodsky, now the fully fledged People's Commissar for War, had ordered his forces to take control of all bank vaults and arrest all bank officers. We must tear the entire machinery of banking from the hands of plunderers, marauders, and speculators, he explained in a secret memorandum. We must drive out these saboteurs and replace them with honest servants of the people. Within 24 hours, Povodsky's units had seized all the major banks in Petrograd and Moscow. We acted quite simply, Lenin reported. In the morning, the banks were occupied, and in the evening, the Central Executive Committee issued a decree stating the banks are declared national property. When bank employees greeted the government's nationalization decrees by going on strike, the Bolsheviks responded, with still sterner measures. 2 weeks after seizing the banks, it was prohibited far more complicated than nationalizing the banks. The Bolsheviks' attempts to nationalize industry added substantially to Russia's economic crisis. At the root of the difficulty stood Lenin himself, for at no time before October 1917 had he encouraged his comrades to look far enough into the future to see the time when they might wield power themselves. "We have not yet won power," he had reminded them at the beginning of October. "Socialism has not yet been achieved, and we have not yet achieved even the beginning of the world of the socialist revolution. It therefore would be inexpedient, premature, and even harmful," he cautioned, "to inject into the party's economic program an overdose of detail." Even as Kerensky's government entered its final days, the Bolsheviks continued to debate the prospects of war, not its issues. By late October 1917, they still had not formulated a concrete program for Russia's economic transformation from capitalism to socialism that went much beyond the April theses, in which Lenin had called upon Russians to repudiate the war, confiscate the lands held by church, state, and landlords, abolish the police, the army, and the bureaucracy, and transfer all power to the Soviets of workers, and thus soldiers' deputies. How to take control of Russia's industry thus remained at best a question to consign the methods and timing of nationalization to the realm of Marxist theory. While Lenin and the Bolsheviks had concentrated upon political questions during the summer and fall of 1917, Russia's factory workers had demanded higher wages and an 8-hour day. As spring turned into summer, and as Russia's economic crisis had deepened, proletarian factory committees in Petrograd had called upon the workers to save the nation from disaster by taking control of the workplaces. Those who stand at the workers' benches must save the revolutionary Russia. It is up to the workers to demonstrate initiative, where the industrialists and entrepreneurs do not. The first Petrograd Conference of Factory and Mill Committees therefore had concluded at the beginning of June 1917 that the path of escape from disaster lies only in the establishment of effective workers' control over the production of goods. Despite later claims that the factory committees comprised one of the brightest pages of the revolutionary workers' movement of 1917, and that the workers' control became the best school of economic administration for many thousands of those who stood in the workers' vanguard, neither became the panacea to which their defenders envisioned. Panacea? I don't know what the word is. It's a funny word. While Lenin and the Bolsheviks had concentrated upon political questions during the summer and fall of 1917, Russia's factory workers demanded higher wages. Despite later claims that the factory committees comprised of one of the brightest pages of lapses into extortion and outright banditry did not blind Lenin to the value that Bolshevik-dominated factory committees might have as platforms for launching political action during the fall of 1917. If we are speaking of a proletarian state, he wrote at the beginning of October, then workers' control can become a countrywide, all-embracing, omnipresent, most precise, and most conscientious accounting of the production and distribution of goods. Yet, as the months after the February Revolution already has shown, Men and women who spend their lives at looms and lathes could not be transformed into managers easily, even in a proletarian state. Without the help of specialists skilled in management and technology, Russia's factories would flounder. And such men could only be found among the industrialists of the old regime. We must compel the capitalists to work within the framework of the new state organization, Lenin insisted. We must employ them in service of the new state. Lenin therefore called for a countrywide, all-embracing workers' control over the capitalists in order to assure that these men serve the people with the same energy that they had dedicated their private interests before the revolution. We shall place them under the comprehensive workers' control, he promised in his pamphlet. We shall achieve the complete and absolute operation of the rule. He who does not work, neither shall he eat. Lenin thus envisioned workers' collectives of Russia's industries, not as a means by which workers would take over management. Factory committees must now become instruments for extending government authority, not for defending the workers' interests against the government. In a proletarian state, government and workers would be one and the same